Chapter 5 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 5, The National Uprising. The guns of the Sumter bombardment woke the country from the political nightmare which had so long tormented and paralyzed it. The line of the North was fully roused. Betrayed, insulted, outraged, the free states arose as with a cry of pain and vengeance. War sermons from pulpits, war speeches in every assemblage, tenders of troops, offers of money, military proclamations and orders in every newspaper, every city radiant with bunting, every village green a mustering ground, war appropriations in every legislature and in every city or town council, war preparations in every public or private workshop, gun casting in the great foundries, cartridge making in the principal towns, camps and drills in the fields, parades, drums, flags, and bayonets in the streets, knitting, bandage rolling, and lint scraping in nearly every household. Before the lapse of 48 hours, a Massachusetts regiment, armed and equipped, was on its way to Washington. Within the space of a month, the energy and intelligence of the country were almost completely turned from the industries of peace to the activities of war. The very children abandoned their old-time school games and played only at soldiering. From every governor of every free state to whom the President's proclamation and the requisition of the Secretary of War were addressed, most gratifying and loyal answers were promptly returned. They not only promised to obey the call and furnish the regiments asked for, but in their replies reflected the unanimity with which their people rallied to the defense of the assaulted Union. The governor's call was published on yesterday, and he has already received the tender of 40 companies, said Illinois. Our citizens throughout the state will respond with great enthusiasm to any call for sustaining the government against the designs of the conspirators, said Vermont. 10 days ago we had 2 parties in this state. Today we have but one, and that one is for the Constitution and Union unconditionally, said Iowa. The war spirit rose above all anticipation, and the offer of volunteers went far beyond the call. We have 6,000 men in camp here, and will have 8,000 men by tomorrow night. I have also made a tender of 6 additional regiments, to which I have received no answer. I shall put the 6 additional regiments in camp and under discipline, and hold them subject to the government's order, at least for a time. Such was the greeting from Indiana. A no less inspiring report was made by her sister state. I find that I have already accepted and have in camp, or ready to march instantly to it, a larger force than the 13 regiments named as the contingent of Ohio under the late requisition of the President. Indeed, without seriously repressing the ardor of the people, I can hardly stop short of 20 regiments. The telegrams and letters here quoted are fair samples of the language and spirit with which the people of the North answered the President's official summons. Special mention deserves to be made of the untiring zeal and labors of the various executives of the free states in organizing and equipping troops, which earned for them the popular and honorable title of the War Governors. If we would catch a glimpse of the dramatic forms in which popular fervor manifested itself in the President's own state, we need but read how the town of Quincy, Illinois, sent away her first company. Yesterday, Sunday, Captain Prentice left with his command for Springfield. At 12 a.m., all the pastors of the city with their congregations met the gallant captain and his loyal company in Washington Square to give them a parting benediction. 6,000 or 7,000 persons were present. A banner was presented, a hymn was sung, prayer was made, and the soldiers addressed by one of the clergymen and myself. We then marched with them to the depot, where the Star-Spangled Banner was sung, many thousands joining in the chorus. The scene altogether was the most solemn and impressive I have ever witnessed, and showed unmistakably how intensely the fires of patriotism are burning in the hearts of our people. In the Gulf States, the revolutionary excitement rose to a similar height. but with contrary sentiment, all Union feeling and utterance vanished, and overawed by a terrorism which now found its culmination, no one dared breathe a thought or scarcely entertain a hope for the old flag. The so-called government of the Confederate States, convinced that it must at length confront actual war, made such haste as it could to put an army in the field, manifesting meanwhile an outward gaiety at the prospect which its members could hardly have felt at heart. Montgomery telegram stated that the Cabinet of the Confederate States read President Lincoln's proclamation amid bursts of laughter. Alexander H. Stephens was reported as saying in an Atlanta speech that it would require 75 times 75,000 men to intimidate the South. In addition to the 21,000 volunteers conditionally asked for on April 8, the rebel Secretary of War notified the governors of the 7 cotton states that 32,000 more must be immediately got ready to take the field, and also asked that the forts and military posts within their limits be formally turned over to the control of the Montgomery authorities. Arkansas and Tennessee, not yet being members of the Confederacy, permission was asked of their executives to plant batteries to blockade the Mississippi. Spare guns from the captured Charleston forts were sent south, and extraordinary efforts were made to concentrate an army at Pensacola for the reduction of Fort Pickens. It was at this time, April 17, that Jefferson Davis issued a proclamation inviting applications for letters of marque and reprisal, under which privateers were offered the opportunity to roam the high seas and ravage the commerce of the United States under the seal of these Confederate states. The final hope of the rebel leaders was in cotton and free trade, and they believed that privateering was the easy stepping stone to European intervention. The reasoning was plausible and the time not ill chosen, but the proclamation found itself confronted by the prompt precautionary act of the United States government. 2 days later, April 19, President Lincoln issued a counter-proclamation setting on foot a blockade of the rebel ports in pursuance of the laws of the United States and of the laws of nations, and declaring that offenders under pretended letters of marque would be held amenable to the laws against piracy. Thus 16 states in the North and 7 in the South stood opposed in the attitude and preparation of war. Between these two extremes of sentiment lay the debatable land of the border slave states, the greater portion of their citizens tormented with anxiety, with doubt, with their affections evenly balanced between the Union on one hand and slavery on the other, with ties of consanguinity permeating alike the North and the South, with the horrible realization that in the impending conflict they were between the upper and the nether millstones. To a certain extent, the governors of these states had hitherto professed to share the irresolution of their people. Openly, they still expostulated with the cotton states against precipitate disunion, and urged instead that all the slave states should join in a convention and demand constitutional guarantees from the North. All this, however, was largely a mere pretext, because they very well knew that the extreme demands which they formulated would not be granted. Secretly, most of them were in the revolutionary plot, and when by the assault on Sumter and President Lincoln's call for troops, they were compelled to take sides, all save 2 immediately gave their voice and help more or less actively in aid of the rebellion. This course they began by refusing the regiments called for under the President's proclamation. Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister Southern states, answered Governor Magoffin. I can be no party to this wicked violation of the laws of the country and to this war upon the liberties of a free people. You can get no troops from North Carolina. So ran the response from Governor Ellis. The people of this Commonwealth are free men, not slaves, and will defend to the last extremity their honor, lives, and property against Northern mendacity and usurpation, was the reply from Governor Rector of Arkansas. In such unholy crusade, no gallant son of Tennessee will ever draw his sword, wrote Governor Harris. Your requisition, in my judgment, is illegal, unconstitutional, and revolutionary in its object, inhuman and diabolical, and cannot be complied with," said Governor Jackson of Missouri. Chief among the plotting border State executives was Governor Letcher of Virginia. A former chapter has set forth the drift of that State towards rebellion under his leadership and instigation. The apparent Union majority in the Virginia Convention had somewhat restrained and baffled him and his coadjutors, but now they adroitly turned the fresh war excitement to their own advantage. Pretended Virginia Unionists had aided secession by clamoring for the unconditional evacuation of Sumter and other forts. Now that the Government and the North resolved to repel force by force, the ground necessarily sank from under them. They were overwhelmed with arguments and reproaches. One or two vainly essayed to stem the tide, but when Anderson's flag went down, even their measured and conditional patriotism withered like Jonah's gourd. There was nothing more but brass bands, meetings, war speeches, and torchlight processions. The Virginia commissioners reported Lincoln's answer to the convention without comment, and shrinking Unionists admitted that if the President means subjugation of the South, Virginia has but one course to pursue. Governor Letcher did not need any stronger hint, with a dramatic affectation of incredulity and deliberation, to impress not only public opinion, but especially the wavering, dissolving majority of the convention. He waited a day before telegraphing his refusal to furnish troops, repeating the staple phrase about subjugation. Then, in the face of his own avowed project to capture Fort Monroe, and with the assaulting guns of Beauregard still ringing in his ears, he replied to Cameron, "You have chosen to inaugurate civil war." Meanwhile, the fever heat of the populace communicated itself to the convention. An outside states' rights assemblage of prominent Virginia politicians, which thronged into Richmond at this juncture, added its not inconsiderable tribute of pressure to the sweeping tide of treason. Under such impulses, the convention went into secret session on Wednesday, April 17, and by a vote of 88 to 55 passed an ordinance of secession, or as they softly phrased it, an ordinance to repeal the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. On the same day, Governor Letcher signed a proclamation announcing the dissolution of the Union and the existence of the rebel provisional government, and calling on all the armed regiments and companies of volunteers in the State to hold themselves in readiness for orders. Nor did his zeal confine itself to paper edicts. Under his instructions, doubtless matured and prepared in advance, seizures of the Custom House and government buildings in Richmond, of a private powder depot in Lynchburg, and of a number of steamers in the James River were hurriedly made, and military movements were begun to capture the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the United States Navy Yard at Norfolk. Of the two remaining border slave states, Delaware lay in such an isolated geographical position, and had withal so few slaves, that she was practically a part of the North, though still dominated in her local politics by pro-slavery influence. Allied to the South rather by tradition than by present interest, her executive took refuge in a course of inaction. He replied by saying that the laws of Delaware gave him no authority to comply with the requisition of the Secretary of War, and that the organized volunteer companies of the State might at their option tender their services to the United States, and to this effect he issued his official proclamation. The people took him at his word, and by their own action bore a patriotic and honorable part in the dangers and achievements of the Union Army. Of more immediate and vital importance, however, than that of any other border slave state was the course of Maryland in this crisis. Between that state and Virginia lay the District of Columbia, originally 10 miles square of federal territory containing the capital, the government, and the public archives. In Baltimore, the chief city of Maryland, centered 3 of the great railroad routes by which loyal troops must approach Washington. It was a piece of exceptional good fortune that the governor of Maryland was a friend of the Union, though hardly of that unflinching fearlessness needed in revolutionary emergencies. Whatever of hesitancy or vacillation he sometimes gave way to resulted from a constitutional timidity rather than from a want of patriotism, and with brief exceptions to be more fully narrated, he was active and energetic in behalf of the Government. The population of the State was divided by a sharp antagonism, the Unionists having the larger numbers, the secessionists the greater persistence and daring. The city of Baltimore was so far corrupted by treasonable influences that Wigfall had established a successful recruiting office there for the rebel armies. As yet, disunion was working secretly, but this increased rather than diminished its effectiveness. Like the other border State executives, Governor Hicks had urged concession, compromise, peace, and joint border State action to maintain the Union. In this, while his colleagues for the greater part used such talk to cover their meditated treachery, he was entirely sincere and patriotic. When Lincoln's call for troops reached him, he had no thought of refusing or resisting, but nevertheless hurried to Washington to deprecate civil war and to ask that Maryland soldiers might not be sent to subjugate the South. Since the President had never entertained any purpose of subjugation, Hicks was assured that the Maryland regiments should be employed to defend Maryland itself and the Federal District and Capital. The Governor thereupon wrote to the Secretary of War, "The condition of affairs in this State at this time requires that arms shall be placed in the hands of true men and loyal to the United States Government alone, and requested arms for arming 4 regiments of militia for the service of the United States and the Federal Government." Other prominent Marylanders were already combining for demonstrative action to sustain the Government. A congressional election in the State was near at hand. On the day of the President's proclamation, Henry Winter Davis announced himself in a Baltimore evening paper as a candidate for Congress upon the basis of the unconditional maintenance of the Union. But the official announcement and the exciting rumors with which the newspapers were filled had also stirred the disunion elements of Maryland into unwanted activity, and the pressure of sentiment hostile to Federal authority was quickly brought to bear on Governor Hicks and developed the timid and hesitating qualities of his character. He issued his proclamation April 18, containing, among many sage counsels in behalf of quiet and peace, 2 paragraphs doubtless meant by him for good, but which were well calculated to furnish the disunionists hope and encouragement. "I assure the people that no troops will be sent from Maryland unless it may be for the defense of the national capital. The people of the State will in a short time have the opportunity afforded them in a special election for members of the Congress of the United States to express their devotion to the Union or their desire to see it broken up." With this outline view of the political condition of the country at large, and especially of the border States of Virginia and Maryland, let us follow events at the Federal Capitol as recorded in the daily reports of General Scott to the President. On April 15, the day on which Lincoln issued his first call for 75,000 troops, the general says in his report, "I have but little of special interest to report today, except that Colonel Smith, the commander of the Department of Washington, like myself, thinks our means of defense with vigilance are sufficient to hold this city till reinforcements arrive. I have telegraphed the commander at Harper's Ferry Armory to say whether he can station to advantage for the defense of that establishment additional recruits from Carlisle. The ground about the armory is very contracted and rocky." General Scott's daily report, April 16, then proceeds, "For the President, he has no doubt been informally made acquainted with the reply of the officer commanding at Harper's Ferry yesterday, viz., that he wants no reinforcement. Nevertheless, as soon as the capital, the railroad to the Delaware at Wilmington, and Fort Monroe are made secure, my next object of attention will be the security of Harper's Ferry, proposing in the meantime, or rather suggesting, that the spare marines from the navy yards of Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and Boston be promptly sent to the Gosport Navy Yard. This relief may serve, by compelling the secessionists to enlarge their preparations, to give us time to send a regiment of volunteers to that important point in advance of any formidable attack upon it. With the authority of the Secretary of War, we are engaged in mustering into the service 8 additional companies of district volunteers. These, I think, place the capital a little ahead of impending dangers, and we will maintain at least that advantage till, by the arrival in a week of regulars and abundant volunteers, our relative advantage will, I trust, be more than doubled. General Scott's Daily Report, April 17. I repeat in writing some details which I had the honor to submit verbally to the President this forenoon. 3 or 4 regiments from Massachusetts, believed to be the first ready under the recent call, may be expected, 3 of them to arrive here and 1 of them at Fort Monroe in 2 or 3 days. 1 of the 3 may, I think, be safely spared for Harper's Ferry if the danger there, and I shall know tomorrow, shall seem imminent. Captain Kingsbury, a most capable officer of the Ordnance Department, goes up this afternoon for that purpose and to act a few days as superintendent, that is, till a new appointment of a civilian can be made. 2 of the Massachusetts regiments are needed here. 1 of them I shall endeavor to intercept at Baltimore and direct it to Harper's Ferry. As soon as 1 of the 4 reaches Fort Monroe, it perhaps may be safe to detach thence for the Gosport Navy Yard 2 or 3 companies of regulars to assist in the defense of that establishment. By tomorrow, or certainly the next day, we shall have Colonel Delafield here, an excellent engineer, to send to Gosport with a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, giving the necessary authority to devise, in conjunction with the naval commander there, a plan of defense. Colonel Delafield will take instructions to call for the 2 or 3 companies of regulars as mentioned above. Accepting the reinforcement of Marines suggested yesterday, and until the arrival of more volunteers, I know not what else can be done for the security of the Gosport Navy Yard. Tonight, all the important avenues leading into Washington shall be well guarded. The current demoralization of politics in the country had infected the Army and the Navy, and striking high as well as low, misdirected the zeal of Captain Adams, caused the dishonor of Major General Twiggs, commanding the Department of Texas, and carried into rebellion Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston, the Quartermaster General, and Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the Army. Among these victims of the states' rights heresy was yet another man destined to become prominent in the rebellion, who undertook the maintenance of a principle and a policy by him recognized and acknowledged to be false and monstrous. This was Robert E. Lee, a West Point graduate, an accomplished and experienced soldier, frequently recognized and promoted, the captor of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and recently, March 16, 1861, made colonel of the 1st Cavalry by the Lincoln administration. He was about 2 years older than President Lincoln, of fine presence, ripe judgment, and mature manhood. Lee was a favorite of Scott. Under the call for troops, the General-in-Chief at once selected him, in his own mind, as the most capable and promising officer in the service to become the principal commander in the field. And of this intention he spoke to many without reserve, having no misgiving as to his loyalty. Scott's confidence proved to be sadly misplaced. Repeated resignations and defections had very naturally engendered in the minds of the President and the Cabinet a distrust of every officer of Southern birth. Lincoln therefore requested F. P. Blair, Sr., an intimate friend, to ascertain Lee's feelings and intentions. On the 18th of April, the 3rd day after the President's call for troops, the day after Virginia's secret secession ordinance, and the day before the Baltimore riot, Mr. Blair invited Lee to an interview, informed him of the promotion and duties to which he was soon likely to be called, and thus unofficially offered him the command of the Union Army. A flat contradiction exists as to the character of Lee's answer. Cameron, then Secretary of War, says he accepted the offer. Montgomery Blair, then Postmaster General, says he was undecided what he would do. Both these gentlemen apparently derived their information from the elder Blair. On the other hand, Lee himself asserts that he declined the proposition because, though opposed to secession and deprecating war, I could take no part in an invasion of the Southern States. He further explains his motive to have been an unwillingness to take part against my native state or to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. But in his interview with Blair, he also affirmed that secession was anarchy, that if he owned the whole 4,000,000 slaves of the South, he would sacrifice them all for the Union. And he appears to have substantially repeated the sentiment written to his son a few weeks before as follows: "Secession is nothing but revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation, and surrounded it with so many guards and securities, if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. It was intended for perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble, and for the establishment of a government, not a compact, which can only be dissolved by revolution or the consent of all the people in convention assembled. It is idle to talk of secession. Anarchy would have been established, and not a government, by Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and the other patriots of the Revolution." Under a liberal interpretation, Lee's personal denial must be accepted. But the times, the circumstances, his qualifying declarations, and the strong statements of Cameron and Blair clearly reveal his hesitation and indecision. After his interview with Blair, Lee sought an interview with Scott, where the topics which filled men's hearts and occupied men's lips, Union, secession, Virginia, subjugation, duty and honor, defection and treason, were once more, we may be quite sure, thoroughly discussed. It is morally certain that Scott, also a Virginian, gave Lee a lesson in patriotism, but he caught no generous emulation from the voice and example of his great chief. From Scott's presence, Lee seems to have retired to his home and family at Arlington to wrestle with the haunting shadows of duty. Pregnant news came to him thick and fast. The secession of Virginia was verified in Washington that same evening. The next evening, the 6th Massachusetts marched in mingled pride and sorrow to the Capitol, having made an immortal record of service to their country. Here were new and important elements to influence his decision. Virginia seceded, Maryland in revolt, Washington threatened, Sumter lost, the border states defiant, the Confederate States arming and uttering a half-official threat that the rebel flag should float over the Capitol by the 1st of May. If the walls of Arlington heard secret or open conferences with conspirators from Washington or conspirators from Richmond, no record of them has come to light. But Saturday, April 20, Lee wrote to his old commander: "General, since my interview with you on the 18th instant, I have felt that I ought not longer to retain my commission in the Army. I therefore tender my resignation, which I request you will recommend for acceptance. It would have been presented at once, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from a service to which I have devoted all the best years of my life and all the ability I possessed. Save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." Lee was at the time, in military phrase, on leave of absence, and without waiting to hear whether his resignation had been accepted or even recommended for acceptance, as he himself had urged, without awaiting further orders or permission or discharge or dismissal from service, on the 22nd of April he was, by the Governor and the Convention of Virginia, appointed to, and on the 23rd in Richmond, publicly invested with, chief command of the Virginia State forces under the secret secession ordinance, and Letcher's revolutionary proclamation, with all his military obligations to the United States intact and uncanceled, thus rendering himself guilty of desertion and treason. No danger whatever menaced his native state. The President had positively disclaimed all intention to invade it. In the course of events, we find him not alone defending his native state, to which he owed nothing, but seeking to destroy the Union, which had done everything for him, opposing war by promoting revolution, and redressing grievances by endeavoring to establish anarchy. In instructive contrast with the weakness and defects of Lee, we have the honorable conduct and example of General Scott. He, too, was a Virginian who loved his native state. He, too, was opposed to secession and deprecated war. He, too, as officer, commander, diplomatist, and statesman, had learned from books and from men the principles and practice of loyalty, and perhaps better than any American exemplar, was competent to interpret a soldier's oath, a soldier's duty, a soldier's honor. To avoid bloodshed, he had declared his individual willingness to say to the seceded states, "Wayward sisters, depart in peace." But underneath pride of home, affection of kindred, and horror of war, on the solid substratum of consistency and character, lay his recognition of the principle of government, his real, not simulated veneration for the Constitution, his acceptance of the binding force of law, his unswerving fidelity to his oath, his undying devotion to his flag. The conspirators had long hoped for the assistance of his great name and authority. They filled the air with rumors of his disaffection. Since its abrupt secession ordinance, the Virginian Convention had sat with closed doors. But through a responsible witness, we know that on the day on which Lee wrote his resignation, April 20, a committee of that convention called on General Scott to tempt him with the offer of the command of the Virginia forces. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, on his way home to arouse the great West in aid of Lincoln's proclamation, told the circumstance in graphic language to excited listeners. "I have been asked whether there is any truth in the rumor that General Scott was about to retire from the American army. It is almost profanity to ask that question. I saw him only last Saturday. He was at his desk, pen in hand, writing his orders for the defense and safety of the American capital. Walking down the street, I met a distinguished gentleman, a member of the Virginia Convention, whom I knew personally, and had a few minutes' conversation with him. He told me that he had just had an interview with Lieutenant General Scott, that he was chairman of the committee appointed by the Virginia Convention to wait upon General Scott and tender him the command of the forces of Virginia in this struggle. General Scott received him kindly, listened to him patiently, and sent to him, 'I have served my country under the flag of the Union for more than 50 years, and as long as God permits me to live, I will defend that flag with my sword, even if my own native state assails it.'" An eyewitness reports that the rebuke contained an additional feature of unusual impressiveness. When the spokesman of the committee, a man of venerable years and presence, had vaguely and cautiously so far unfolded the glittering lure of wealth and honor which Virginia held out, that the general could catch the drift of the humiliating proposal, Scott held up his hand and said emphatically, "Friend Robertson, go no farther. It is best that we part here before you compel me to resent a mortal insult." That same afternoon, Scott also telegraphed to Senator Crittenden in response to an anxious inquiry based on the false rumors set afloat about him, "I have not changed. I have not thought of changing. Always a Union man." And in that unshaken mood of patriotism he lived and died, beloved of his country and honored by the world. The Virginia secession ordinance, though secretly adopted on the 17th, became quickly known to the people of Richmond. It was immediately announced to the States Rights Convention in session in another hall, and Governor Letcher, Senator Mason, ex-President Tyler, and ex-Governor Wise from the convention soon appeared there and glorified the event with speeches, the latter lamenting the blindness which had prevented Virginia from seizing Washington before the Republican hordes got possession of it. Nevertheless, an effort was still made to prevent the news from going north. But that evening, some of the unconditional Union delegates from Western Virginia, then a part of the Old Dominion, deemed it prudent to shake the Richmond dust from their feet and secure their personal safety by prompt departure. Delegates Carlisle and Dent were in Washington on the 18th, and in all probability informed Mr. Seward and the President how irretrievably Eastern Virginia was committed to rebellion, even if Governor Letcher's reply and proclamation had left any doubt on that point. Ominous rumors came from Harper's Ferry, and also a premature report of the burning of the railroad bridges beyond Baltimore. On that day, too, a detachment of 460 Pennsylvania volunteers, almost entirely without arms, and a company of regulars from Minnesota had been hurriedly forwarded from Harrisonburg to Washington. The unruly elements of Baltimore were already in commotion. The cars containing these men being in their passage through the city cheered by the crowd at some points and hooted and stoned at others, though no casualties occurred. Noting all these rumors and acts of hostility, Secretary Cameron telegraphed to Governor Hicks that the President is informed that threats are made and measures taken by unlawful combinations of misguided citizens of Maryland to prevent by force the transit of United States troops across Maryland on their way pursuant to orders to the defense of this capital, and strongly intimated to the governor that the loyal authorities of Maryland ought to put them down. The events of the week, the daily mustering of volunteers, the preparations for defense, the telegrams from the various state capitals, had thrown Washington into a military fever. The social sympathies of the permanent population of Washington, and especially of its suburbs, Georgetown and Alexandria, were strongly Southern, but the personal interests of its inhabitants and property holders were necessarily bound up with the course and fate of the existing government. The Union manifestations were for the moment dominant, and volunteers came forward readily, even with some enthusiasm, to fill up the district quota. The city was also yet full of office seekers from various states, North and West. Cassius M. Clay of Kentucky and Senator-elect James H. Lane of Kansas, both men of mark and courage, after an evening or two of flaming speech-making, organized them respectively into the Clay Battalion and the Frontier Guards. These companies of from 30 to 60 men each were what might be called irregular volunteers, recruits from East and West of all ranks in the great army of politics, who came forward to shoulder a musket without enlistment, commission, paymaster, or commissariat. By this time the danger had become so threatening that every scrap and show of military force was welcome and really useful. The government furnished them arms and gave them in charge of afterwards Major General David Hunter, who on the evening of the 18th stationed Clay's company in Willard's Hall with orders to patrol the streets, and took Lane's Frontier Guards to the post of honor at the Executive Mansion. At dusk they filed into the famous East Room, clad in citizen's dress, but carrying very new, untarnished muskets, and following Lane, brandishing a sword of irreproachable brightness. Here ammunition boxes were opened and cartridges dealt out, and after spending the evening in an exceedingly rudimentary squad drill under the light of the gorgeous gas chandeliers, they disposed themselves in picturesque bivouac on the brilliant patterned velvet carpet, perhaps the most luxurious cantonment which American soldiers have ever enjoyed. Their motley composition, their anomalous surroundings, the extraordinary emergency, their mingled awkwardness and earnestness rendered the scene a medley of bizarre contradictions, a blending of masquerade and tragedy, of grim humor and realistic seriousness, a combination of Don Quixote and Daniel Boone altogether impossible to describe. However, their special guardianship of the East Room lasted only for a night or two, until more suitable quarters could be extemporized, and for many days they lent an important moral influence in repressing and overawing the lurking treason still present in a considerable fraction among the Washington inhabitants. The graphic pen of Bayard Taylor, who happened to be in Washington on this same afternoon of April 18, has left us a sharp and strong historical picture of the city at the time. Everywhere around me the flag of the Union was waving. Troops were patrolling the streets, and yonder the watchful Marshal Layman was galloping on the second horse he had tired out since morning. Everybody seemed to be wide awake, alert, and active. On reaching Willard's Hotel, the scene changed. The passages were so crammed that I had some difficulty in reaching the office. To my surprise, half the faces were Southern, especially Virginian, and the conversation was carried on in whispers. Presently I was hailed by several Northern friends and heard their loud, outspoken expressions of attachment to the Union. The whisperers near us became silent and listened attentively. I was earnestly questioned as to whether the delay of the mails was occasioned by rails being torn up or bridges destroyed. Everyone seemed to suspect that a treasonable demonstration had taken place in or near Baltimore. The most exciting rumors were afloat. Harper's Ferry was taken. Virginia had secretly seceded. Wise was marching on Washington, always winding up with the impatient question, "Why don't the troops come on?" From Willard's Hotel, Bayard Taylor went to the State Department and afterwards to make a call on Lincoln. He continues: I need not describe the President's personal appearance, for nearly everybody has seen him. Honesty, firmness, and sound common sense were the characteristics with which personally he impressed me. I was very glad to notice the tough, enduring vitality of his temperament. He needs it all. He does not appear to be worn or ill, as I have heard, but on the contrary, very fresh and vigorous. His demeanor was thoroughly calm and collected, and he spoke of the present crisis with that solemn, earnest composure which is the sign of a soul not easily perturbed. I came away from his presence cheered and encouraged. End of chapter 5.